Tommaso and I work between what we would call human-centric and technology-centric areas of design. And that can vary from a completely unpopulated space to a populated space. From something that's driven by AI to other things that are machine learning, back down to human endeavor. But when we think back to the Crystal Palace in the 19th century and bring it forward to today in Tesla's Gigafactory, what we think is that there has often been an underestimation of how industrial architecture has shaped the last 2 centuries. We tend to focus on some grand projet, but not so much on the factory. But recently, we can't avoid it. The data center, the networks, the automated production that holds together our world in this time has become very essential. And we want to explore a bit this evening how the relationship between people and objects, people and buildings, and our perception and understanding could modify over time and also shape the way that we plan and design. Our first question would be, what is it we do when we're influenced by non-cultural entities? Not everything is linear. Not everything starts with the Parthenon. And that's a track that Tommaso and I take.
And clearly, I think what we know is that no matter where you work at the small scale or at the big scale, but in today's built environment, scale matters. And whilst this diagram is obviously provocative in as much as Tesla's new gigafactory in Reno, Nevada, actually lies flat on the ground and not vertical. What we know is that these often invisible forms of the built environment are having an increasing weight in society, both in terms of economic production, energy consumption, and obviously employment, whether it being human or robotic. Next. No, sorry, I'm skipping too much. Go back. Yeah, so this again is the Tesla's factory in construction, and now they're building other few across the globe. Next. And similar in kind, the proliferation of data centers that Iain has already mentioned before across the globe and now supporting critical online activities has largely gone unnoticed, both in contemporary urban theories and design practices until now. And it would be in a way strange to give just a traditional metric in either square meter or square footage of the impact of these facilities. It's probably more relevant to talk about the fact that they consume globally around 416 terawatts, which is already significantly higher than, for example, the 300 terawatts hours that the whole of the UK is consuming every year. Next. And clearly, current advancements in artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, big data, custom manufacturing, IoT, robots, and critically, social media and platforms will only increase the need for further industrial development and for further construction of such facilities. Next. And sometimes I wonder if both as a society and somehow as a profession, we kind of got taken by surprise, not so differently of the apes in 2001, by these mysterious monoliths, which literally landed from space. So I think, what's something that I think drove a lot of the practice that myself and Iain have done in the last year was to kind of consciously decide to fully engage with these particular forms of the built environment and trying to shape a meaningful coexistence with it. Next. And so much more in a time in which I think we are accelerating the shift from an economy based on the networking of human intelligence towards a new economy where clearly human intelligence will be always relevant, but in which the networking of machine intelligence and the infrastructure that supports this networking of machine intelligence will be increasingly important and relevant for both the architecture and the urban profession.
If we switch for a moment to the subject-object or human interface, I'm quite intrigued by this image of Alessandro Mendini, the designer who I researched under a long time ago, and one of his products, Anagio little bottle opener. One thing that strikes you about both of those images is the fact that there's empathy with them. They're not strange, they're not somehow distanced, but they're somehow human, and yet they are both machines, one to guard your eyes and one to open a bottle. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, I think Umberto Boccioni and the futurists tried to capture what this four-dimensional space of living was like, what speed was like, but of course they didn't have digital media, so they had to draw it. And it's interesting, if you think of today and the way that we see how things are progressing, the subject-object has become quite a mixed area. We have the humanoid robot, then we have the robot that's not humanoid, then we have the robot that interfaces with people that we call the cobot, and then we have the other artificial surfaces that we can wear, so we become almost semi-robotic ourselves. Well, what's interesting, of course, is the relationship as well between science, technology, and art. There's a very much a STEM approach to things. And Tommaso and I would argue that there's also, along with some others, a STEAM approach, where A is for art and architecture. So the relationship between art and interfaces, where the interface can be seen as an intrinsic part of the production of a contemporary condition, is very important, that it can capture and the flow and ebb of information and media, which is everywhere. What we're looking at is the work of Richard Weigan, an information artist, who looks at the world that we can't see and then contrasts it with the world that we can. And for Richard, he very much believes that there's a whole world of, a whole set of machines, of cities, of structures in another dimension that we walk through, we experience, but we don't plan or embrace. This is a university that's being built in Singapore, and recently we were asked to look at some interventions. And one of the interventions was to try and have a smart space, or a space that would intrigue people. And we're just in the middle of a process. But on the right, you see some space that was pre-designated to be smart, where people would gather, etc. We can't quite see what was smart about it. So we thought, what might be a different take on this? So there were humanoid robots and non-humanoid robots, but what we were really intrigued in was the penguin pool at London Zoo, the Wittgen's famous penguin pool. And it dawned on us that penguins and little robots were kind of similar. There was a playful aspect, and why couldn't it be above and around us? They're not necessarily connected with us, but maybe that was inspiring. And so we put that together in a series of spaces within what is going to be constructed, and then superimposed on that something called Embassy of Data, which is a disk you see, which is a physical and metaphysical representation of all that radio that you can see around you. If I go back to the late 80s, I was trying to imagine what this sort of environment would be like inside your domestic living space. But of course, there were no CGI, so we're drawing with oil crayons, etc. The objects and interfaces were there. And then trying to make prototypes. This is a dressing table that would open up, and you would have screens and other informatics there. If I fast forward to a couple of years ago, here's Mendini creating a large object sitting in a public space. Now, is this an information booth? This is a work of art. There's an ambiguity here, subject, object, what's your relationship with it, that intrigues us, much as we're intrigued by other sentient aspects. If we go back again to another great Milanese designer, Ettore Sottsass, we would think of him as laminates, or these very unusual, almost block-like buildings or pieces of furniture. But he is also famous for changing our perception of how you use tools, the typewriter, the portable typewriter. And it's interesting with computing, we're still wedded to the typewriter. We're only really now in the last few years breaking free of that interface, and we'll come back to what that interface might be. But on the right-hand side, you can see one of the great supercomputers that was built in the 1960s by IBM. But in the middle is a quantum computer. And this quantum computer that's been worked on, researched by MIT, what's interesting here is not just the scale, but what it appears to be. And on the left are some interfaces that are being looked at as to how do you want to interface with technology? And what does that mean? And how is that in the physical world as well as the material world? I think we can go a bit further here with art though, and look at the aspect of what is a wall, what are objects, how are you relating to them, the semiotization of space. So it's beyond just sculpture, because all of these things can be live or they can be inert. But machines aren't all terrifying. These are all machines. These are pieces from washing machines, computers, etc. Isabel and Helen, designers in London, to create a display in a window. So the machine world can be an entertaining world, a bit of product placement there. This is a picture of Olivetti's first large computer center in Ivrea. And what you notice about it is of its time. In the 60s, clear light, the machine is there, a lot of infrastructure, but it's not that dissimilar from another building. We go forward to the late 90s, we started building networks. On the left is the first pure data center built inside an office building. Then we're in Amsterdam, then we're in Munich, and today you have the mega hyperscale data centers and the green data centers on the right-hand side that Arab are working on in Germany. But what's interesting is if I flick back to the influence of technology in cities, this is the former Gordon gin factory in 1999-2000. We converted this into Europe's largest data center. So on one side was its classical frontage, and on the other side was a circuit board reflecting the 25,000 servers that were inside the building and the control rooms. So we've got both an existing and a future architecture that we're trying to deal with, adapting cities and creating new spaces. I wish I could have had David Park envisage Goswell Road for me 20 years ago for planning. But this is where we are in the last few years. This is 10-story data center. It's about 4 or 5 times the cost of a corporate headquarters sitting in Docklands, going 50 meters into the deck for reinforcement, 40 megawatt substation beside it. This is what we've got on the board, from data centers connected to waste to energy plants to data centers are using 300 megawatts, which would light up a city in the bottom right, or running from generators connected to the oil and gas network in Ireland. On the left is something Tommaso and I started working on about 2.5 years ago, which was to try and use parametric design, DFMA, etc., which we were working with in real projects, to take everything into almost an ambivalent, ambiguous skin. And then last year we went one step further and decided to give it a touch of Mendini and see which we preferred, or maybe both have got a relevance. But what we were thinking about here was the fact that we're looking for a new aesthetic, and we haven't quite found it yet. And why aesthetic? Because urban gaze is important. What you see, whether through a machine or whether through your own eyes, also leads towards our understanding, perception, and acceptance of the world that we're in. And if you look ahead a little bit, what's interesting is, bottom left, we're trying to go 20 stories. Top right, we're using immersion cooling where technology is sitting inside liquids. And in the middle, we're thinking about that point that Tommaso touched on, which is how much energy do we need? What happens in 2030 if 20% of the world's energy is going into machines to organize autonomous vehicles, etc., our Google search, our gaming? This is a very telling image. This is a data center inside a church. So 20 years after Goswell Road, somebody's doing something similar, and just a striking image to me because you have both beauty and another kind of beauty. you have both practicality and another practicality. You have people coming together and machines coming together. And the future isn't all going to be in Iceland, but some of it will.
Right. I'm going to tell you a quick story about two projects. The first one is a project that myself and Iain started probably back in 2014, 2015, and lasted around 3 years. We are in Britain's energy coast in West Cumbria, just next to the Lake District National Park. And we were assigned to master plan and envision the architecture for the largest new build nuclear project in Europe. Project totaling around 15 billion of investment, and located just next to the historical nuclear site in the UK, which is Sellafield. Next. And you know, the experience here was that clearly, you know, we couldn't design and we couldn't configure this site with traditional tools. And although, let's say, the architecture itself, you know, it's fairly simple. We're talking about functional boxes. The choreography of the movements across the site, we noticed that the simple, in a way, engineering solution wasn't not possibly, you know, the more efficient, but definitely not the more effective. Therefore, we started working with essentially time-based scripts and time-based analysis of the different movements for both the human and the non-human agents, essentially traversing in time this complex site. And what we came up with is essentially a series of scripts, a series of scores which define in time the different movements across the site. And if you go to the next one, in parallel, we were also facing a challenge, which is essentially the one that we discussed before, is the challenge of being able to you know, give a meaning and give a even potentially a poetic angle to these large-scale infrastructures in the landscape. And for us, you know, clearly we referenced you know, fairly archaic landscape structures, such as the stone circles in Cumbria. And we started thinking about, if you go to the next one, we really started to think about, you know, how this fairly abstract structure would appear in the landscape. Therefore, starting to work with an idea of planes, starting to work with an idea of reflectivity and an idea of landmark on the Cambrian landscape. And next. And again, it's really about, you know, how you would perceive these very large structures, you know, across the territory, and how some of them could become essentially, you know, a signpost, but also a symbolic reference for this infrastructure. Next. Not so dissimilar to what artists have been doing in the last years across landscapes. And this is I think a very beautiful example of it, which is this large installation by Richard Serra in Qatar. And we thought that, you know, there are some elements here from the artistic expression which could potentially come to in a way the rescue of these large scale infrastructures. And if you go to the next one, this is how we started to translate that, you know, that concept into the whole, you know, aspects of, you know, the functionality and the environmental quality of these elements, and trying to translate, as we usually do as architects, an idea into a feasible concept and into a consentable concept. And if you go for a couple of slides, we ended up in a, then the interesting part is that you have to start to engage with the community. And if you go to the next one, it was, although the project finally stopped for financial reasons, we got to the second stage of public consultation, in which, again, you can see the, and this for us, especially for me, was a big lesson in how then you know, certain conscious decision can make a big difference, because they quickly become you know, the public image of a project, and quickly become essentially what communities can actually start to engage with in a more conscious manner. The second project that I wanted to go through quickly with you is about London's industrial intensification. And the project started from a series of analyses that we conducted through GIS across London. And it was about a study, if you can just kind of scroll. It was a study about identifying the opportunity areas and starting to overlay them with the remaining industrial land in London, which, as probably many of you know, is kind of shrinking at a higher pace than predicted by the previous two London plans. But also important elements of change across the London's geography, such as the mayoral development corporations and the employment zones. And so we started kind of tracing that with what we think is an invisible but essentially important part of the contemporary urban landscape, which is essentially fiber networks. And these are a tracing of both the metropolitan, the faster, and the long haul fibers coming into London from the transatlantic hubs on the edge of the island. And then we started to essentially plot what would be an optimal industrial development, but not only, let's say, in a traditional sense, but an industrial development that could see a virtuous mix of essentially data, energy, and logistics. Why is that? Because we think that, sorry, go one back. Because we think that there is a strong correlation between, especially between fiber and energy. Because in a way, where there is fiber is, you know, you can also potentially find energy, and therefore fuel up some kind of new forms of industrial development. And if you go to the next one, this is how we then brought this into practice. I mean, we built a couple of data centers in Slough, but we also think that you know, the mixed industrial use is really where we should be going as a city. We studied different opportunities with partnering with global operators such as DHL, and really started to study how then we could actually link up these facilities with for example, with London business improvement districts, and with the emerging environmental regulations such as the ULEZ across London. And next. And you know, and that's something that we think could also change the game in terms of okay, now there is this buzzword of the circular economy, but you know, we really think that master planning and planning in particular have an incredibly important role to play. And you know, we really think the circular economy is not just about, you know, how you can get rid of the waste from your building. I think is also creating you know, a strategic planning across town, in which you can link you know, essentially city center with mixed use industrial facilities, in which, you know, you can recover the material, you can manage waste, and then you can bring full track of loads into the city. One more. These are some prototypes which we've been studying, which we haven't yet been able to take off the ground. Probably we're a bit too early. But again, this is what, you know, connecting to that very first diagram is about how you can actually bring these important drivers of change, such as AI, data storage, e-commerce, 3D printing, big data, and urban logistics into vertical facilities, which are both dense and are also compatible with other uses, such as residential or offices on the sites. One more. And again, this was us really trying to explore how even on extreme facilities with vans going up to what is essentially 6, 7, 8 stories could be compatible with an urban center, especially in light of the electrification of vehicles and potential to work on smart envelopes to make that viable. And one more. And then not only at the single building level, but we also thought that these kind of elements could actually become the catalyst for the regeneration of, for example, of many of those industrial parks within the city of London. This is the one next to Wembley Stadium, for those of you who know the context. And again, we also acknowledge the importance of the smaller scale industrial facilities which are actually there, and which, we understand it would be a very important element in trying to understand how to also keep that levels of more informal or more local businesses within this new structure, which should actually could become for them a way to scale up and to connect with global networks of both delivery and businesses. And I think the next one is yours, Iain.
Yeah, so just to recap a little bit about what Tommaso has been talking about, we often start with this diagram when we're talking with city authorities, major developers, schools of architecture, engineering, etc., stakeholders. To us, the digital real estate, the digital economy, the world that we're in now is composed of three great magnets: productive architecture, as Tommaso has described, data infrastructure we're talking about, and energy infrastructure. And you can't have smart enablement without all three working together, because without it, it just doesn't work. It's not about location. It's not about placemaking as we knew it, or certain human interactions. So we think that there are different tools required now in looking at some of this. It's not to say it's exclusive, but it's certainly a big part of our built environment, and we need to look at that in a more diverse way. If we look ahead a little bit to how we might see cities being planned, or how do humans react to places where they don't quite understand where they are, or vice versa, how do we integrate machines where we want to have spontaneous human movement? These are questions that we're just beginning to deal with now, because if I have a delay of up to 10 nanoseconds in a data center, that could be a 10-foot delay, some people think, in an autonomous vehicle, an error. So from a safety point of view, it just shows you how a resilient infrastructure is so important. But more importantly, when machines talk to machines, there isn't the same interaction between the human. So we're also then having two different systems working at the same time. We've been trying to envisage a cityscape where we don't need to have color or decoration or lights necessarily, because we're not sure machines read color. What if they just need points of light or intensities of light? What if this other world that Richard Weigan was talking about is a completely different world from the one we experience, but it's there? Can we juxtapose both together? Something that we're trying to think about at this moment. Because streets that take out carbon dioxide or put in a certain cool or have a different set of infrastructure may not look anything like a street we know today. So the question really is, if that neighborhood is next to another neighborhood or co-joined, what is the transition when you move between them? What's your perception, understanding of that? How ambiguous, as we said before, the spatial ambiguity question might it be? this is the other dimension that Richard Weigan talks about. This is his Hertzian landscape, where the human basically is an observer of what machines are saying to each other, of another reality. You could take part in this, you could participate in this, but not necessarily in the way that you're used to. And that Hertzian landscape is something that very much interests us, because what if we were starting to plan from that density of information we've just been looking at, 4 dimensions? But to step back a bit to where we are today. So Tommaso was talking about urban logistics. We were talking about super strong structures for data centers. And when we were talking about putting it together, we thought, if we lay out a modern industrial estate or a modern industrial zone, the urban code has changed. It's not like it was before. So while the manufacturing landscape is evolving rapidly and life cycles of companies are getting shorter, as we say, new planning concepts are needed to cater for the needs of the growth industries. But city authorities normally evaluate the success of development on the number of potential jobs it will create. But what if the jobs are mixed between human and machine? We've got 19th century building codes and 20th century planning zoning trying to keep up with 21st century advance and change and emergence. So in this smart block, what we see is a large super strong structure that can flex the uses within it. And as Tommaso said, if the vehicles are quiet, the clean tech industry is quiet, if the emissions are 0, then probably the only noise you can hear is somebody chatting in the canteen. But what about this aspect? Could these fit within the CBD? Could they sit within a residential? Yes, they could. In fact, you might argue that we're going back in time to the tenemental city, the city where everything was mixed up. Now, if we can't get on mass public transport at present, or if we may never get on transport to the density we used to, we then need to think about where are things being created, where they're being made, and where they're being dispatched. Click and collect, the 20-minute peak time movement of logistics, the ability to think of something and have it made somewhere else in different hemispheres. So maybe we've got hemispheres of production. And of course, we see that sitting within the cityscape, being able to change the facade through plug and play. But rather than changing a floor because it's made of concrete, what if we were using super strong composites and they were a series of logs, and then you have a screed for fireproofing? You can break that down over the weekend and carry it out in the lift. It's super strong, but super light. So there are some advances that we need to think about. So we have nanotechnology materials, which can dissipate great amounts of heat. As thin as a piece of membrane as you would be able to find, much thinner than the simplest piece of cellophane. What if we use that for dissipating heat or fire protection, etc.? Where does that take us to? What goes underground is also important, because we were talking about Moorside, and if one of the things in Moorside was that we had very limited real estate area footprint for all the non-nuclear island buildings. So we redesigned with the engineers the cold water system that went across the entire site, which enabled us to gain another 20,000 square meters of footprint. What's above and what's below is important. Started working at Hinkley Point. It was 120 hectares. 11 iterations of the master plan later, we had got it to 65. We'd saved 40% of the site from being developed. So in a city where we may move things under, we may put people on the ground, where do the machines go? This is a very simple idea, which is to take a mini nuclear reactor, to give it a completely anonymous skin and place it in the center of a city so that we can get 50 to 100 megawatts. And this image here is another version of the smart shed that Tommaso was showing, but this time we don't take vehicles inside it in terms of trucks, etc. We cross dock at the bottom, and then we take a range of services above, either with e-bikes or e-vans or lifts. We think we can take the energy, plug and play, so we don't have to have large infrastructure, and put them side by side in the center of the city. So you've got a mini nuclear reactor, which is so ambiguous. You could put a dance deck on it next to a residential block and next to what we call Smart Shed 3.0. And a whole range of uses. We can take floors out, we can put people in. Recently, we've been working on something called Stack and Go in Bangkok, and that's a much taller version of this, with half of the floors above being devoted to residential typologies. So let's think about the city. What if we want to go high? Why is it we put a few people at the top with a view? What if the engagement is at the surface, the first 4, 6, 8 floors? And below that, we have the movement, and we have the logistics, and above that, we have the machines. That would be a totally different environment. And then let's not forget drones. Everybody talks about drones. I don't think drones will be quite as ubiquitous as people think, just on an air traffic aspect. But drones can be delivering, they can be watching, they can be doing many things. This is a drone study carried out with EPFL in Lausanne, looking at an area of Glasgow. What would happen if we wanted to bring drones in? And this is one of a series of studies of different types of drone travel and how that relates to the surface of the city and to the buildings that they're going to. Recently, we've been doing some research with MIT to look at taking 9 mini nuclear reactors, or 1 or 2 or 3 or up to 9, and placing them on a site. And one of the aspects, the challenges for this site was to say, what happens with automation? What happens, can people walk through this? This is a passive type of technology so that there can be no meltdown or breakage a la Chernobyl. So we inverted the common logic, which is to have a set of reactors, then what they call support ancillary buildings and balance of plant. And we actually put all the reactors which are automated around the human populated area, which we would then over time see go from 900 down to possibly 90. And we don't see it as a power plant. We see it as an energy campus, as a clean tech campus. And so therefore, initial studies, we portrayed it as that, no different from a pharmaceutical or a teaching campus that you would find in the center or on the city edge. Not forgetting the visitor center, simple structures that we're now starting to work with to give them a more expressive form. And if I was sailing or walking along the beach, would I be looking at a sculpture? Thank you very much. Thought we better put that one in, Tommaso, just to prove that we actually do build some of these buildings.
Thanks so much, Ian, and thanks so much, Tommaso. Thanks for sharing that presentation. So if people have questions, please put them in the chat. But I just wanted to start off to say that I really found the analogy of the industrial use and the kind of big data use in London really interesting. And I guess like in the peak of the UK's industrial revolution, terrace housing was being built for the workers alongside warehouses. Kind of how do you see the integration of residential and these kind of huge shed warehouses hosting these machines?
Well, maybe.
Yeah, that's a. Should I go? You go? I go.
Yeah, you go.
No, yeah, it's a good question that it comes up very often, and I think both myself and Ian share a common view, which is first and foremost that there's been a kind of trend in talking about beds and sheds or possibilities in a way of stack these uses vertically, which we find quite naive. And therefore, I mean, we know probably what shouldn't happen, which is essentially a kind of vertical integration of these uses. What we really think is that you know, there can be an horizontal, in a way, coexistence, and even a topological difference. You know, you mentioned the Industrial Revolution, and you know, I'm just thinking that you know, how much, especially with, you know, potentially a greater emphasis on working from home, whatever, you know, happens with the current situation. I find, like, you know, typologies, for example, like the Victorian house, quite you know, quite resilient, simply because, you know, you've got a different of spaces, etc. And you know, why not? Why, if well designed, I think that you know, there can be essentially two things. The first one is that industry can go vertical, and therefore you know, achieve higher densities, and freeing up urban land for housing, for example. Now, whether that housing needs to be vertical as well, or, you know, it can have a different approach, maybe something that, you know, goes back also to, you know, to terrace house, etc. That's up for grabs. But what we know is that you can definitely stack industrial uses, and the more you stack industrial uses, the more you create that kind of proximity of intelligence and workers that actually creates value, and therefore free up you know, valuable land for example, for residential uses, or let's say mixed use.
There's maybe something there, isn't it, Tommaso, that we've been talking about remember the augmented urban plot, and this is quite an interesting one. I think, Rosie, in so much as you can break a city block down, or you can assemble it as Tommaso was saying, in a different way. What's clear to us is that this vertical and horizontal manipulation is really where we think the interest can be. But at the same time, you have to have an energy grid and an infrastructure grid to allow it to play in different ways. That's why there needs to be some mobility with infrastructure, as well as permanent infrastructure, because of the investment. And just the normal physical planning doesn't, we think, allow for that, especially when you put the fourth dimension in. But it's interesting, let's say that we put hotel, office, factory, data all in the one building. It's not inconceivable that we can do that mix. And indeed that we can even move it around inside the building, as we said earlier.
And just, I think, to finish on that, Rosie, there is also another aspect which you could definitely go the way in which we're going now, therefore building more industrial outside the city, but you know, and obviously, and freeing up or converting industrial land into residential, which is what's been going on for the last, you know, 20 years. I think, you know, a key aspect that we've learned is that if you do that, there is a great increase in vehicle traffic, and you're talking about, you know, the great increases in vans, in deliveries, etc. So, you know, you can take the building out of the city, but, you know, it gets back into you know, split up in millions of vans every day. Therefore, I think, you know, the GLA especially needs to, and it's going that right direction in terms of industrial intensification, etc. But what is clear is that, you know, strong policy with strong incentives to actually build vertical industrial will be needed going forward.
Yeah, I was interested in Iain kind of picking up on this idea of 19th century planning policy, and still a world where the things have changed so rapidly. Are you kind of working with local authorities in this way, and is your research kind of?
Yeah, in fact, in several places. For example, we've been interfacing with the URA, which is the Urban Redevelopment Authority, along with other practices and consultants in, say, Singapore. Been over in Seoul, talking with people there about other approaches to urban districts, which would become mixed use again, but not as we would normally see it. I think it's quite interesting that Tommaso talked about public consultation. Over the last 10 years, particularly with the mega schemes, we've been doing a lot of DCO work. And it's being able to take what it is that you're looking at in terms of the complexity and then break it down into elements that people not just understand but engage with, can have a view on, can feel that they could be involved in that aspect. And actually it's something I would actually touch on, I think, a little bit, which is I think on that question that, in summary, I was talking earlier about this meta interface, and this, we've been talking about increasing influence of technology on the transformation of urban as well as natural, human and post-human. I wouldn't call them landscapes, I might call them machinescapes. But there is also an accelerating entanglement, not just between humans, but also humans and non-humans, which requires an ontological approach that might go beyond the understanding we have of planning systems today. And I deliberately say that because if we've got machine-to-machine and AI dialogue going on, and shall we say influence, we need to factor that into the process. And then we need to be able to take value and decisions as to whether that's what we want.
Yeah, and building up on what Iain was saying is that I think the other big contrast that we face is that, take logistics, for example. I mean, supply chains globally are highly integrated, and they are kind of the bigger issue getting into territories is that, regulation and devolution at the political level is actually increasingly fractured, and devolution goes into this direction, so that in a way you have on one side highly integrated supply chains, whether it's energy or goods, and on the other side you have an increasingly fragmented regulatory system, which is preventing some of the innovation that would then fill up interesting and sustainable development, essentially. And going back to your question, the 19th century planning, that's true. I mean, in London boroughs, it's a good example of that. And it's actually quite interesting, the fact that Slough, for example, as a special planning zone in London, has actually capitalized the most on essentially technological capital coming into London in the last 10 years, and we work with them, and I think it's an interesting example of how probably London and the borough system is mostly at times ineffective in attracting the value that large global corporation or large technological players can bring into a city like London.
Great, I think we've got a few questions coming in. So I'm going to unmute Christopher Smith.
Hi there. I have two questions. The first relates to your sort of the aesthetic definition you give to some of the projects. And I wonder, to what degree is the data center about defining, say, this unique typology for a building that hasn't really existed before? And to what degree is it about making it something familiar, say, blending it into the fabric? And then my second question is, and it is, again, specific to the data center, because I can appreciate a logistics network, and I think it's important to make the distinction between the two, with proximity being so important to a logistics network versus a data center that can be located rurally. Is it not more of a rural question given land values in the case of the data center? If you look at something like Iceland now is a place where they're putting a ton of Bitcoin mining farms because, you know, there's access to clean energy and things like this. Like, are we going to see this sort of tension between the rural and the urban? And are you going to start seeing some more the definition of certain more specific types being going to one or the other?
I think they're both very good questions. I'm going to start with the first one, Christopher. I think computer rooms, as they were originally called, started off in traditional architectural envelopes buildings. Then, as they moved out because their technical requirements required specialized structures, it became warehouses that were first of all picked up, and then they were built as bespoke elements. One of the reasons why a lot of them are and still are built in cities is that not all data centers do the same function. They have different tiering, they have different density of computing, and actually it's not always the big ones that have the greatest density, it's sometimes the edge technology. So you might have nano trades in the city. Security for decades was a big issue. People wanted to be able to get to their servers within 30 minutes, what's called the half-hour windshield. Then we went through other aspects. So 2 watts of power to cool 1 watt of computing. So that meant that you were using 3 watts for 1 watt of IT. The PUE, as it's called, the utilization efficiency. Now that's dropped to about 1.1, 1.3. But one of the aspects about that is you need a lot of water. Now another aspect though is that water is a scarce resource as well. And then there's output heat, the heat islands. So that's why immersive cooling has come in, where you can embed servers in effectively cold oil. But what I would say is that it's not all going to Iceland or rural areas. It's quite the contrary. You've got a whole stack of stuff in the city, and you're right, you've got a stack of stuff in the countryside. But at this point in time, not as much as warehousing and gigafactories and other things that seem to be moving there. But let's say it's part of a wave that needs to be thought through. Then there's the other aspect, which is, you know, when you were talking about what might they look like. Well, up until about 8-10 years ago, I would say that virtually every global corporation or network I worked with did not want the building to have an identity. They wanted it as stealth as possible. Now we might put a sign on it, although it's got high security. And one of the questions there is a bit like nuclear: how do you make that passive security and open up the city? Because if you look at all the infrastructure in the city, there's huge amounts of the city are grayed out, basically. So I think you're right to say there's definitely an urban-rural dimension to this, but it's not one size fits all. And one of the things I think interests me in immersive cooling, for example, rather than free-to-air or other forms, is that I reckon for 1 megawatt, say 1,000 square meters of technical space, you can get 300 square meters for immersion cooling. So if we're getting smaller but denser and more intense, that kind of points the way where some things might go. But Tommaso did make the point as well. There are land values involved here, but the land value compared to the construction and the returns on computing is quite different from other forms of real estate. Say you were getting, I don't know, top site £120 a square foot in a city like London, or 130 for rental. You would get 300 to 500 depending on the type of computing that you've got and you're hosting and doing. So, but at the same point, that one in Docklands 10 years ago, that would have set you back base build 100 million. So think what it costs now when you're building hundreds of thousands perhaps on a campus at tier 4 or above. So yeah, I think this is definitely of the moment. Various people have suddenly woken up to this, but I think there is a question as well, which is that some of the larger players are commoditizing almost the process. So I've got a system, let's wrap a performance envelope around it. Now that happens in other forms of activity. But if you take architecture design in the wider urban aspect or rural aspect out of it, then we have a blandness, and we have a, you know, like a sort of the average warehouse that we just don't want to have there if you can avoid it. So yeah, very pertinent points. Hopefully that answers some of what you're asking.
Thank you.
We've just got one more question before we wrap up. So Samantha, I'm just going to unmute you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So my question might be a little bit peripheral, but I got really interested when you were making the analogy between the stone circle and the vertical volumes of the data center. I was just thinking, because I was thinking more about the material of the new construction, because just because of the scale and the different building logic of the proposed kind of smart development of the new architectures, they are of a different nature of, per se, mason, like stone masonry, or old like wooden construction. Like, what is the life cycle of like the material used in the construction of your, like the architecture in your vision? Because from my knowledge, or like from my education, I think like the material used now have more initial embodied energy because of the transportation, or like the making of it. And then of course the maintenance aspect, like every now and then you would have to like perhaps rebuild, or like,
Yeah.
I'm not, yeah, that.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Samantha. Thank you. Very different responses regarding context, but I will start from the first one, which is the example in Cambria, which just as a note is a nuclear power plant, and therefore let's say most of its structures have a very long inbuilt lifespan. You know, we're talking about 100+ years, whilst you know, a typical building would, you know, be built for what, 50, 60 years. Therefore, you know, clearly the use of materials with an incredibly long life is important, but at the same time is important how you disassemble it and the embodied carbon. Therefore, in that case specifically, we started to explore a large-scale prefabrication on site using concrete, by the way, which we all know is not the most or the less it's not the most sustainable material, but at the same time, you know, you can use essentially forms of concrete with which are less carbon intensive, and in a sense, that scale of a project in a place in which infrastructure is like zero. I mean, you're talking about essentially a countryside roads. We explored what was already, you know, back in the 40s, 50s, a fairly common way of prefabrication, which was prefabrication on site. Therefore, essentially building up factories on site, which would both, you know, mix concrete and actually build up prefabricated elements. So that was a particular case with a very, very long lifespan, which we addressed in that way. And, you know, there is another aspect which goes back, I think, to Christopher's question, which is for other forms, maybe require like data center, etc., requiring probably a lesser of a lifespan is, I think, and the next big question will be, you know, how do you dismantle these buildings? You know, how do you, you know, essentially inbuild the potential of them freeing up those greenfield that are taken up in the rural areas, which I think is, or being used for other uses, maybe when, you know, computing would be radically different potentially in 10 to 20 years. Therefore, you know, I think this is what we're looking at the moment, and I think it goes back to the questions of aesthetics. So you know, how do you then express a certain kind of you know, essentially component-based approach to these architectures? I think will be increasingly relevant, and clearly new methods of fabrication will be key to explore.